Yeah, thank you for joining, everyone. We just say that, as you probably know, the 50th anniversary of Black Tot Day is on the 31st of July. So a few weeks in advance, we just wanted to give you a bit of an overview of the anniversary and why it's so important to Black Tot as a brand. So talking about the last consignment and also the rest of the brand and how we've moved on, a bit about what we're doing. And we wanted to introduce you to Robert Rumble, who's the curator at HMS Belfast. So obviously you hear a lot from us about drink and about spirits, but we wanted to be able to give both sides. So you'll get the history side of what Navy rum really meant to the Navy as well. So yeah, I think we've got everyone. So Mitch and Rob. Oh, and so you know, I'm recording this. So if anyone has to drop it out at any point, we'll have both Billy and I are recording it. So we'll definitely have a full recording. So yeah, if you need it, I'll send it around to everyone anyway afterwards. And if you've got any questions, if you just pop them into the chat, Mitch and Rob will try and answer them as we go. And then at the end, there'll be time for a proper Q&A where if you want to speak to them, we can bring you back in. So yeah, now I'll hand over to Mitch and Rob.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Emily, and thank you everyone for joining us today. It's lovely to have you with us. So yes, this year is the 50th anniversary of Black Tot Day, which in the rum calendar is one of the most historic landmarks, and especially being the 50th anniversary this year, we obviously want to make a little bit of noise about it and share some rum with you all. So we're sorry we can't do this in real life, but obviously we look forward to doing that very soon too. So yes, so just to introduce myself, so I'm the global ambassador for Black Tot Rum. So normally I'd be traveling around bringing all the rum to you guys there, but at the moment we're doing the best we can. So hopefully everyone has their rum, everyone will have a little drink with us today. And I'll be taking you through the rum portions of Navy rum history. And my special guest today is Robert Rumble, the curator from HMS Belfast. So welcome, Rob.
Good afternoon, Mitch, and thanks for having me. Yes, my name's Rob Rumble. I'm a curator for Imperial War Museums, and I'm the curator for HMS Belfast, our largest object in the collection, and a unique example of Britain's naval heritage, docked just past Tower Bridge on the Thames in London.
And we'll have to throw a boat party there once all things are open again, Rob.
I've experienced a couple of those before, and that sounds like a fantastic idea, Mitch.
Fantastic, get those cannons ready. So today we've got a few rums for you to try. You should have 6 rums in your lineup if everyone can double check. You've all received those, wonderful. So as I say, I'm going to be guiding you through some of those rums. So whether you're a complete newbie to rum or you're a rum professional, hopefully there'll be something in there for you today. And obviously, please, if you have any questions at all through any of the rum chat or history that we're going through today, please pop them in the chat and we'll try and make sure we cover those off for you as well. So to get you started, I think it's always good to start these things with a bit of rum. So if you've got your Barbados rum there, please feel free to pour yourself a little glass now. And we'll begin this little Navy rum journey. So the history of Navy rum is fascinating. We're going to be discussing a lot of this with Rob today in the actual culture of Navy rum itself. But to give you a bit of background, the Navy rum blend itself was a blend of different countries from all across the world. So sometimes you'll hear stories today about, the Navy rum had to come from here, or it had to be this particular rum, or it tasted like this. That's not entirely accurate. The Navy rum blend itself was really a world blend of different countries from all around the world. And yes, of course, the British Navy used to go to British ports whenever they could because it made sense to buy from their own distilleries. But we also have in our records, they bought rum from Cuba, from Martinique, from Indonesia, from Africa. They went as far as Australia as well, which we're going to see in one of the videos today. So really the Navy rum blend brought all of this world of rum together. And it was never limited by 1 or 2 different islands or 2 different places. So today, though, we're going to start off with our little Barbados rum. Now, this is a 5-year-old Bajan rum coming from the Foursquare distillery. It's a mix of pot and column still, which is pretty typical for Barbados. Barbados always tends to be pot and column based. Barbados rum, typically, if you were trying to describe it, for me, it would be the sweet spot of all rums. It's where I'd start anyone on their rum journey. You know, it's tropical, it's pineapples, coconuts, vanilla. It's like the pina colada of rums, you know. So I think it's a beautiful place for us to start. All of our rums today as well, except for the very last one, the last consignment, we've given to you at 46.2%, which is the same ABV as our Finest Caribbean up here. So you'll be able to sort of try all the individual components on their own and then the final run with it together. So Rob, to start off with, obviously we know that the Navy had rum on ships, which seems unusual by today's standards, but obviously back then was a very different world. How important was the Navy rum ration to the crews back then?
Well, the Navy rum ration was, to many of the accounts of sailors who served in HMS Belfast, it was one of the highlights of their day. It was a tough life, hard work, sometimes monotonous, sometimes dangerous, and the rum ration, the rum tot, was a most welcome part of their daily schedule. Each day at 11 a.m, the bugle call for the rum tot was made, and the sailors would each present from their mess a rum bosun who would collect the ration of rum for his messmates from the provision issue room. Now, this is a photograph of our town class cruiser, HMS Belfast, and she was one of 10 cruisers designed and built for the Royal Navy in the late 1930s. The Royal Navy at that time was a completely worldwide organisation, policing the trade routes of the British Empire around the world. And Belfast and her sister ships were built to essentially to combat the rising threat from the Japanese Empire out in the Pacific and Britain's territories and cities that she controlled at the time, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Australia. And the ship was launched on St. Patrick's Day, 1938, built at Harlington Wharf in Belfast and named after the city that she was constructed in. So there was always an element of Belfast having a bit of the luck of the Irish about her, being named after an Irish city, built in an Irish city, and being launched on St. Patrick's Day. And indeed, Belfast turned out to be quite a lucky ship. She was always a happy ship, crew morale was always high, and in her 25 years of service, only 2 sailors were ever killed in action while serving in Belfast, which, considering she saw service throughout the Second World War and the Korean War, was quite a feat. Now, Belfast is one of Imperial War Museum's 5 branches. And in my opinion, as her curator, I think she's the best. 12,000 tons, our largest object, 82 years old, and the last of her kind. She is the last big gun British warship of the mid-20th century. So something really special.
Fantastic, Rob. And to give us an idea, what were the crew size on HMS Belfast? How many people would you have had on board? The
crew throughout her history was between 900 and 1,000 sailors. So that's a lot. And the sailors were, it was a very hierarchical system on the ship. From everyone had their role, everyone had their job, from the officers to the ratings, to the Royal Marines, to the stewards. And the rum ration was part of the tradition enjoyed by the ratings, the ordinary seamen, the enlisted seamen on HMS Belfast.
what would that proportion have been, Robert? So how many out of that 1,000-odd crew would you have been having drinking
You
rum?
would have had around 250 officers and Marines, so the 650 to 700 or so would have been the enlisted ratings, the ordinary sailors, and they would have come from various walks of life. The majority would have been volunteers in the Navy, originally coming from the famous seafaring cities of the United Kingdom, Glasgow, Liverpool, Plymouth, Southampton. Yet at times of need during the Second World War, there were volunteers and recruits from all over the United Kingdom and also from around the rest of the British Empire and Commonwealth. We had sailors, there's one officer was Indian, we had Ghanaian sailors, and also Chinese stewards served in HMS Belfast as well.
Fantastic. So, and so if you had around 650 people drinking their rum ration every day, so if we can all ask some friends, if we get 650 people on that boat after the lockdown's over, we can try and recreate a piece of history, right?
That would be fantastic. And as I mentioned previously, the rum ration was to many sailors the highlight of their day, and it held so much tradition within the Royal Navy that the Royal Navy has always prided itself in its traditions, and the tradition of the rum ration dates back to the 18th century to Admiral Edward Vernon, and the tradition of old grog and the age of sail, and it lasted through to the 20th century and provided some light relief for the sailors' working day, and was a welcome gift from the officers to their men.
Fantastic. So I want to explore some of that history with you all now. So as Robert mentioned, this tradition dated back to the early 18th century. So the first ever record we actually have was about 100 years before that. So in 1655, after the Battle of Jamaica, the English fought the Spanish, who'd been ruling Jamaica at that time for about 100 odd years. And there was a month-long campaign on Jamaica. And when the British took it from the Spanish, they looked for something to drink together, and what they had was rum. So the first ever actual issue of rum we see is in 1655. But at this time, there was lots of different booze, lots of different drinks being taken on board. So it wasn't just rum. You'd have gin, you would have brandy, cognac, wine, a lot of beer coming from Britain. You know, certainly on the way out, we would be taking beer casks with us. And part of this, as well as the morale, there was a certain safety in taking booze on board, because if you took water, remember, there's no plastic containers back then in the 1600s, you know, we're putting everything into wooden barrels. This water quite often wouldn't be the cleanest, so you would be getting very quickly algae and different bacteria and disease in this water, and you were safer off having something with alcohol in it. So for short voyages, typically your ship would be equipped with a sort of lighter ABV beer, around 3.5%. And on longer voyages, you were meant to get a higher ABV beer to last longer on the journey. However, when we got to the Caribbean, obviously, what did we bring back? And rum was suddenly this new spirit that was only available in these countries where sugarcane was growing, where the sugar industry was harbored. And so we start to see rum introduced from sort of the mid-1600s. Then 1731 is where we see the first written record of this. So the Navy puts in a daily ration book along with lots of rules for the Navy, because before then it was kind of, you did whatever you wanted to do on your own ship. And when they actually codified it, it gave some structure to the Royal Navy. So their structure began as half a pint of overproof rum for every sailor every day. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever tried to drink half a pint of overproof rum of an evening, but it's a wonderful time. less so the next day. And trying to run a ship, if you can imagine, you know, Robert's ship here, HMS Belfast, a little bit later on, but imagine 1,000 people and 650 of them have just drunk half a pint of overproof rum. It would be madness. There'd be people fighting, throwing each other overboard. Everything would be going crazy. So very, very quickly, Admiral Edward Vernon, who Robert mentioned just now, decided, okay, half a pint is too much. Let's halve that to a quarter pint now. Again, quarter pint has a similar effect to half a pint, you know, maybe less of a hangover, but still the fun part. So that quickly also wasn't in line with what they needed for the Navy. And so Edward Vernon said, right, we're going to water down the rum now. And we're going to take this rum, water down the ration, and that should lessen the effects on the crew. They also halved the rum again, so it went from 1/4 of a pint to 1/8 of a pint. It was watered down, and as you can imagine, at first the sailors didn't particularly like this Edward Vernon, and due to his waterproof grogham coat that he was always seen above deck wearing, they used to call him Old Grog, and his watered down rum became known as grog as well. So this is sort of where that term comes from. Sometimes, again, you'll hear there's so many myths and misconceptions in the Navy rum world. Sometimes you'll hear like, oh yes, they were drinking daiquiris on ship because they were putting lime and sugar in there. And no, grog was pretty much just rum and water mixed together. It'd actually be decades later before they figured out that scurvy was cured by vitamin C. They didn't even know what vitamin C was till about 1926. So yes, daiquiris on board, mojitos on board, all these kind of things. There probably weren't that many sailor bartenders back in the day, but it is obviously a nice story to have. Let's move on to our next rums though, whilst we do that, because I don't want to leave you too parched. Now, the next two rums, if you've got two glasses there, I'd actually like you to do these side by side, or if not, just give yourself a little splash of the first one, try that and we'll go on to the next. So we're doing Guyana 1 and Guyana 2 on this bit. Now, Guyana 1 and Guyana 2, these are two different components that make up our Black Tot Finest Caribbean rum. One of the interesting things which I hope for any rum lovers here might appreciate, or if you're not, I hope you appreciate this anyway, but typically the rum world is famous for misinformation. It's famous for not disclosing what's in its blends or which rums it uses or which distilleries it comes from. And you may see online, if you're ever in rum forums and stuff, a lot of rum companies now are starting to get in trouble for misleading people about the natural sweetness of their rum, or whether they've added sugar to their rum, or whether they've colored their rum, or what's going on. The rum world arguably has a much wider set of rules because there are so many different countries that make rum. And just like the whiskey world, which some of you might be more familiar with, Scotch is very, very well regulated. Bourbon is very well regulated. Irish is very well regulated. And the rum world has certain places which are well regulated and certain ones which aren't at all. So you can have a lot of scope to play with as a rum producer or as a rum blender. And one of the things that I've always kind of felt was quite funny was people would say, oh yes, this rum it's a secret blend. We found these casks, we swam to an island and we discovered this thing here and we can't tell you what's in it. It's like, well, we can tell you exactly what's in it because it's a recipe essentially that our blender puts together. So this is a little insight into sort of the tech specs, if you like, of our rum and the components that you have there. So the Barbados we tried before makes up just over 1/3 of the rum. We've got those Guyanese rums, which make up about 60% of the blend. Now 20% is unaged, and that's your Guyana 1. Now, the more observant amongst you may have noticed that this is quite dark compared to some of the other samples that you have, and yet this is the unaged one. And yes, that's because caramel colouring in Guyana is very much part of their tradition, whether through the addition of molasses to the barrel or, more modern day would be just adding E150A. So much the same as the whiskey world or in the rum world. But what's unusual is that typically you would have a rule in place saying you can't colour a spirit darker than the casks themselves have made it. So if you've aged your cask for so many years, you would add a touch of colour to it. This is an unusual part of the transparency of rum. You know, for us to be fully transparent with you, we show you all the components we have. And when we went to our rum brokers, who have a vast selection of thousands of different rums, we went through many different types. And the particular sort of bitter licorice chocolate coffee note that you get off this rum that's a little bit drier only came as a coloured version. So this is how we have it, and this is what you have to share. Now, the unaged Guyana for me is probably not the rum out of those 4 components that I would reach for first and foremost. The aged one, however, is absolutely delicious. So try the unaged if you haven't already. And for me, again, if you find that very dry, quite bitter, that licoricey kind of note, if there's any cocktail lovers amongst you, you know, when you put those 2 dashes of bitters in your old fashioned, I kind of see that's what this component does in our rum blend. You know, it's that little depth and complexity that you can't get without it. Then the aged Guyanese rum we have, the 3 to 5 year old. This is absolutely my favorite and why it makes the biggest part of our blend. So 40% of the blend is made with this. And this is classic Guyanese rum. So Guyana itself, how this ties back into our story, Guyana was a real workhorse in the rum world. It made a vast proportion of all the rum that went into the Navy rum blend. And Guyana was really considered, you know, one of the cores, one of the hearts of the tot. So Guyanese rum was incredibly important. Guyanese sugar was incredibly important. You may have all heard of Demerara sugar before. You know, you see your brown sugar at the supermarket, it might say Demerara sugar on it. This refers to the Demerara River in Guyana. However, they never trademarked it. So now almost any brown sugar you get, if you look where it's produced, if it doesn't say Guyana, technically it's not really Guyanese Demerara sugar, but most people will call it that to give you your brown sugar. So Guyanese rum, tremendously rich, tremendously chocolate, tremendously coffee, and tremendously important in the Navy rum blend itself. So coming back to, I guess, how these rums were put together. As I say, we were collecting rums from all around the world. Barbados was considered where rum really began, or molasses rum really began in the Caribbean. Then the Caribbean, which by extension is sort of normally included as part of the Caribbean islands in this sense, but even though it's over on South America there, you've got that tremendous amount of Guyanese rum coming through into the blend. And then again, other components will be coming through. So Jamaica and all different parts coming through into the blend. So we'll be looking at these, and we've got some good questions coming through, I can see as well, that we're going to geek out on with the rum as well. So yes, but getting back onto the Navy blends, Robert, when we were looking at these Navy rum issues, when we were looking at the tradition or the ritual of this issue every day of getting the grog and the grog tub up, what did that practice look like? What was that daily ritual?
Well, with many things in the Navy over the years, a definite ritual was settled upon, and now on Belfast during her period in service from 1939 to 1963, the rum itself would have been stored below decks in the rum locker and would have been the sole responsibility of the most senior rating on the ship, the master at arms, who would have been the one key holder of the of access to the rum locker. Daily, himself and a Royal Marine would go below decks to collect the portion of rum required for that day's tot in a barraco, and would bring it up deck to what we call the provision issue room, which was where, well, there was only one provision issued from this room, and that was rum. And we still have our provision issue room on HMS Belfast, looking just as it was towards the end of her commission in the 1960s. A petty officer and a Royal Marine would have then worked through the ratings lists to work out which sailors from which messes were entitled to their rum ration that day. Everything was meticulously recorded, and as you would expect in the Royal Navy. Now, a mess, if I keep using these terms and I'll just explain what that means, was the social group of sailors who lived and worked together on the mess deck. A mess itself would have been a table with benches where they would have ate, where they would have slept, where they would have slung their hammocks, where they would have carried out basic maintenance of their equipment, and where they would have whiled away the hours whilst off duty playing uckers, which was a form of ludo, writing letters to their loved ones, or just otherwise singing sailor songs together. Each mess would have appointed a rum boatswain, and this was quite a popular job amongst the messmates. And I have an example here of Sidney Pickett, who served as the Admiral's Yeoman of Signals aboard HMS Belfast during the Korean War from 1950 to 52. And he was very keen to volunteer for rum boatswain in his mess. It was usually decided by election within the mess, and at 11 o'clock or whatever the time he quotes in his memoirs, we had what was called the mess fanny, which was like an aluminium kettle on a pole, which they used to measure out the rum issue. And you'd travel down from your mess to the provision issue room and present your mess number to the petty officer, who would then measure out the issue of rum to your mess. So as Mitch mentioned earlier, during the 20th century, we're talking 1/8 of a pint. Now, it's already been watered down prior to the issue, and an officer was present by tradition to ensure that the watering down was strictly observed, essentially to show the ratings that they weren't being shortchanged in any way, that they were being presented with the rum that they were issued to. And
So
looks like Mitch is just
yeah, we've got a little video here of the rum being watered down. So can you talk us through this picture, Rob, and just point out some of the people that we've got here, and then we'll play the video as we go.
Well, we have the officer in charge on the left, and then the Marines with the berets on are in there as part of the tradition of the Royal Marines, guarding the rum issue. And then the sailors in their white flat caps are the ratings ready to collect their tot. We can see that's the barraco that's brought up the rum, and we can see that that's being poured into the barrel to meet the water that's already been poured in there. The barrel was a revered object in the ship, and we have one of those in our provision issue room on HMS Belfast. The cask was sometimes known as the grog tub, grog, a term we've heard already, or the scuttlebutt. And traditionally, it was embellished with the words, the King or Queen, post 1952, God bless him, in brass letters. You can see the smaller containers there for measuring out the smaller portions. And then, as I mentioned, the petty officer would consult his list of messes, provide the correct rum ration to each of the rum boatswains, and then the rum boatswain would take that ration back to his mess to then be equally shared out amongst his messmates. Now, the rum boatswain was a popular job because each of the ratings carrying out this role was entitled to what was known as sippers for their trouble. So once the issue had been poured out to all of his messmates, he was allowed to take a small sip from everyone else's tot as way of thanks. That tradition went further. On a sailor's birthday, he was allowed to take gulpers from each of his messmates' tots, which was a slightly larger gulp of rum. And this, to be honest, often caused a little bit of trouble for young sailors who perhaps weren't used to drinking alcohol. And I can go into detail with an anecdote about that slightly later. Now, back in the provision issue room, once the tots had all been issued, if there was any left at the bottom of the barrel, the petty officer, the Marines, and any attendant ratings would ceremonially gift the surplus rum or the surplus grog to the king or to the queen, and then would declare that they weren't present anyway and would share it amongst themselves.
Any excuse, Rob?
Yes, they certainly enjoyed their tot.
We interviewed recently one of the store's accountants, or what they call the Jack Busties on ship, who was responsible for measuring out and calling out the amount of rum that everyone was served. And he had some wonderful stories about how he'd make sure he got more than his fair share of rum at all times. And in fact, because one of the interesting points to note as well is the rum wasn't just, it wasn't just food or something given to you on the ship. It was actually part of your payment as well. So you had the choice as a sailor whether to take the equivalent worth of your rum and have that added onto your pay packet if you made it back to shore, or you could take the rum there and then. And the rum itself could be part of the currency. It was a way of trading and bartering and getting someone to cover your shift, or giving a little extra to the chef so you got some extra food that night. So rum itself had its own currency on board, and generally you were better off taking the rum ration and using that rather than taking the money it was supposedly worth as well. So it was there's plenty of old stories of how the sailors used to keep their bottles topped up in between the rum rations as well. And we've got a little video here as well, which I wanted to show you. This is from the HMS Victorious, and this shows the rum ration in action back in the day.
The daily rum ration was introduced in 1687. In those days, the sailors drank it neat. Then, in 1740, for better or worse, along came Admiral Vernon, who watered it down, and the mixture became known as grog.
This wouldn't stand up well to COVID times. So here they are being issued the grog.
A good sailor is supposed to be able to knock it back in one go. He needs more practice. He'll get it, never fear. Haha, there you are.
I have a wonderful anecdote from a sailor on HMS Belfast, a petty officer gunner named John Harrison, and he served in HMS Belfast in her first commission in 1939, and he describes an anecdote. When Belfast was newly commissioned, unfortunately, she hit a German sea mine at the beginning of the Second World War in November 1939. Now, Harrison, meanwhile, as Mitch mentioned, had managed to, albeit illegally, stash away some of his rum ration in his locker. And he describes here that when we got mined and I got out the turret, things were a bit chaotic and I went down to my locker. I thought I'd have a little sip of that rum, and I opened my locker and I've never smelt such a delightful smell than rum. The bottle was smashed and it was all over my clothes, so the odour was very helpful, but there was no liquid left, and that was the result of keeping it in a glass bottle.
Tried to get away with it. The sailors aren't a far stretch away from most bartenders I've ever worked with, so it's good to see we have common kin there. Anyone who's ever worked in a bar definitely knows that's true. We've got a great question actually that I just wanted to point out from Jan, which is, was rum stored in a barrel when on board, in which case there would have been ongoing development? How long would the ship have been at sea? So how long would a ship have been at sea typically on a tour there, Rob?
Well, Belfast herself was designed to have global range. She would have had enough stores, fuel, ammunition to spend several months at sea before having to rearm, refuel, and revictual. So up to 6 months between calls into port was possible, although ideally those times at sea would have been shorter. And during Belfast Commission, the Royal Navy had victualling points around the world in the various British territories in Ceylon, Singapore, Hong Kong, or wherever. Yes, certainly with regards to storage of food, that could become an issue. But from the experiences I've read, the rum issue was consistently maintained and was available for the ratings. Belfast being a larger ship, this worked quite well. On the much smaller ships, such as frigates and corvettes and other escorts, their range wasn't quite so much, and there could be problems with running out of supplies, which sometimes led to a little bit of discontent with the sailors. However, being with our Belfast being a large and well-equipped ship, that was never a problem for her.
Now, for some of the spirits nerds as well, if you're looking at it from a point of view of actual aging at sea, this again would have been a point of difference compared to how rum or spirits typically move around the world now. So nowadays, you know, if we ship a spirit from one country to another, we'd almost never send the barrel itself, because there's so much risk of the barrel leaking or breaking or anything happening on ship. Also, it takes up more space to send barrels than it does to take, you know, plastic ICBU containers around the world. So typically most things will be shipped in plastic or steel today. But back then, as Jen rightly points out, it would have been shipped in barrel most of the time. And so continuous aging is happening at sea, and depending on to a certain extent how much your boat is getting rocked around, but any boat to a certain extent being on the water is going to have some movement. It's going to keep that rum moving inside the barrel, and you are going to increase the interaction. So we've actually got, for anyone who's joining us on the 31st of July, we've decided, because we're crazy, that we're going to do a 24-hour rum live stream with guests from all around the world. And one of our sessions is specifically dedicated to what we call dynamic aging, this idea of continuously moving the barrel at sea to allow for greater wood interaction, and how it changes the spirit inside. And we've got some fantastic guests joining us for that, who will be going over the science behind some of that too. But But I think we should move on to the next rum because we are talking a lot and we need some Jamaica in our lives. So you can pull out your Jamaica components. Now this is a 3-year-old Jamaica made at the Long Pond Distillery. This one is 100% pot still. So this is going to be a little bit fuller, a little bit bigger than the other ones that you've tried. Now, again, if you're not familiar with the different regions of rum yet, that's okay, and that's kind of why I'm here. And part of what we're trying to do in the rum world itself is help people understand better as a category the different regions, the different distilleries, the different types out there, because other spirits have been tremendously good at this over the years. You know, you'll have even novice whiskey lovers would probably know the difference between a Scotch and an Irish whiskey, or a bourbon and a rye, and they'll usually have a preference as well, depending on that region. Rum for itself, we've been tremendously bad at educating people over the years. So quite often you'll hear rum described as white, gold, and dark. What a shit way to describe any spirit, you know, like it's absolutely terrible. You would never go to a bar and be like, oh, what kind of whiskies have you got? And we've got brown whiskies. You know, okay. Like you would expect, you know, a bit more education, a bit more understanding of where that whiskey was coming from and originating from. And in the rum world, as I say, we've had white, gold, and dark. Some of you may have heard of English, Spanish, French, which obviously ties it back to our colonial times and which islands, you know, spoke which languages and which were ruled by different ways to try and explain the type of rum they made. But what you'll notice today with using that classification, we've tried Barbados, Guyana, and Jamaica. These are all technically by that system English style rums. However, you'll notice all of them are completely different. So these are very archaic terms in the rum world. And if you are talking about rum, I implore you to drop these terms and drop the simplification and start talking about the individual regions themselves, because this is how we start to build up a better understanding and a better education of the province of different rums. Now, Jamaica is famous because Jamaica is so funky and intense, and there are 6 different distilleries on Jamaica. 3 of them really specialize in these very super intense funky rums. 3 of them tend to do lighter style rums comparatively, but even collectively as an island, the rums that they make are generally considered, everything's turned up to 10 or 11 even, you know, it's like all the flavors at the max. And when you smell a Jamaica rum, straight away you get a completely different nose on this rum to anything else. You know, it's like, as well as the nice parts like ripe bananas and tropical fruits, you get, you know, you can get some burnt rubber and tires going on there and petrol, you know, and that kind of intensity of smell is very, very common to some Jamaican rums. I always think if you're the kind of person that goes to the petrol station and fills up your car, and when you're filling up your car, you stand there and you're like, and you like that smell, then you're going to love Jamaican rum. You know, it's all of that intensity really comes through, and they love this full flavor. So 3 year from Long Pond coming through here. So a question from Colin, is Diamond the only distillery on Guyana? Yes, it is now. Guyana has a very varied distillery history with different distilleries closing and passing on their stills to one to another, but there's now only one distillery on Guyana, which is Diamond. Again, we will have the if you're interested in knowing more about Guyanese rum, on the 31st of July, we'll have the master distiller from Diamond joining us for a session purely on Guyanese rum as well. So that should be a fun one too. But anyway, back onto the Jamaica, have a try of this. And what I'd love to know is, as you're trying these at home, which ones stand out for you? You know, are you in the Barbados camp? Is tropical pina coladas lying in a hammock on the beach more your vibe? Are you more about the rich, chocolatey notes of Guyana? Or do you like the funk and intensity of Jamaica? So feel free to let us know in the comments what we're going through here. And just before, let me answer one more question, then we'll get back onto our Navy rum narrative. What tropical aging is. Now, I think Robert and I are probably both guilty of throwing in terms here which are fairly standard in our realms, but make absolutely no sense outside of our own industry. So tropical aging refers to when a rum or a spirit is aged in a tropical country of origin. Okay, so if we're aging that rum in Jamaica, Barbados, Guyana, we would say that that rum is tropically aged. And for Finest Caribbean, that's what we do. We age all of the rum that is aged in its country of origin. Why is that important? Why is that different? The climate, the temperature, the heat, the humidity, all of these aspects are going to play a very important role in how your rum develops in the barrel. Now, if you can imagine, if we brought, let's say we filled 2 rums with Barbados rum, and we brought one straight to Scotland and we aged it in our warehouse there, and we kept the other one in Barbados. In 5 years' time, you're going to have a very different rum. Even though they started off exactly the same, even though those barrels are almost identical, the extra heat, the different climate is going to affect it. And what we generally say is, if something's tropically aged, there's no exact math to it because it can vary from island to island and warehouse to warehouse. But typically we'd say a tropically aged rum would be, say, 2 to 3 times that number if it was continentally aged. So if we said 5-year Barbados, you might think, okay, that's probably somewhere between 10 to 15 years if that same rum was aged in Scotland. Now, that's in terms of the wood interaction, how the spirit's been affected flavor-wise, how much angel share you've had, especially. If you haven't heard of angel share before, angel share is where you get evaporation from your barrel, either of the water or of the alcohol itself. And every year you come back to your barrel of whiskey in Scotland and you might lose 2 to 3% of that barrel. Now that same barrel in Barbados, you might lose 7, 8, 9, sometimes 10% of your barrel of rum every year. And you imagine you've got, say, 200 litres to start with. Imagine losing 20 litres every year. You don't have to go too far before suddenly you're out of rum and that barrel's pretty dry. So this is where tropical aging versus continental aging in Europe would have a massive, massive effect, both in the flavor, the cost of producing that rum, and a lot of other things. So that's the sort of little summary point, but we'll give you, I'm sure Emily will be sending you all my details as well. So if any of you want to get super nerdy on this, you can just drop me an email. I'll be happy to answer all of your questions and just talk rum for hours. So Rob,
yes,
let's talk about navy proof, because this is something that we hear quite a lot with. You might see gins with navy strength, you might see rums at navy proof. What is navy proof? What are they talking about?
Well, it's a particular proof of rum issued at 54.5%, and this was it was possible to test this to ensure that it was the correct proof that the Navy expected. Nowadays, we would use a hydrometer test, but in the past there was the gunpowder test, which I'm not entirely sure of the physics of, but was a surefire way of testing the alcohol content during the age of sail. Now, sadly, I've found no evidence that of any gunpowder tests in HMS Belfast, especially considering the explosives would have been cordite by then. But Mitch, if you have any anecdotes of this.
I mean, they weren't blowing up rum on HMS Belfast.
Sadly not, but by HMS Belfast Commission, fire safety was taken even more seriously than the rum tradition. So, but that would have been a marvelous story nonetheless.
This is unfortunately one of those tales which has, you know, we as bartenders especially love to tell to customers, and we love to talk about in the rum world, but probably in practice had very little place, especially back in the day when there were wooden ships. Imagine setting fire to things on purpose. So what our understanding is, and this is something that we're still researching collectively as an industry, but it appears at some point a measure for proof was taken. Now, what is proof? Proof in the UK for us works out at 57.15% ABV. That is proof. Now, anything above that ABV would be considered overproof, Anything below would be under proof. Now, the Navy actually, this is where sort of part of the story falls down. If proof was set originally by the gunpowder test, which a lot of people say is how they originally sort of settled on that ABV, the Navy actually watered their rum down to 54.5%. So just under what proof was. Now, if their reasoning was they didn't want to get their gunpowder wet or blow up the ships or anything like this, then, you know, watering down the rum didn't make as much sense. They wanted that gunpowder to still light. So we sort of take it with a little pinch of salt or a pinch of gunpowder. But they didn't actually do the gunpowder test in practice, because we had hydrometers, which are basically like little glass tubes that allow you to show off the ABV of your spirit. They had those from the late 1700s, early 1800s, when you had the first, like the Sykes hydrometer and Clark's hydrometer around that time. So yeah, unfortunately, probably not as much. You probably see more fire with rum at your local tiki bar than you would here on the ship. But again, it's a fun story, so it depends on the crowd, you know.
I've noticed in some of some questions in the chat, what was the quantity of rum they'd have received in the 1930s, which is a great question. When Belfast was commissioned, launched in 1938 and commissioned in 39, it would have been the 1/8 of a pint, as Mitch mentioned earlier, along with, and that's the sort of container. Now, the tots for the ratings, as mentioned, would have been watered down. The petty officers, who are the more senior, more experienced ratings, would have been trusted to take their tot neat and to still be able to perform their duties. Completely different way of life for the officers. They would have had their own bars on board where they would have been able to buy their own drinks off duty. And they would, on the whole, had a much higher salary. So they would have been expected to pay for their own alcohol out of their salary. And another question which, well, seems obvious really, how the hell did they operate the weapons, etc.? Well, for the sailors, it was their responsibility to be fit for duty, and being drunk on duty was a punishable offence. So, as we mentioned, 1/8 of a pint, watered down. The sailors, through experience, quickly built up a strong constitution for their rum. Once they were quite used to it, they could, many of them were quite capable and competent in performing their duties. Should they wish to, if they were just about to go on duty following the rum tots, they could have asked a messmate to look after it for them whilst they are on duty to then take once they came back off duty. And they would have been perfectly safe to have done that, because thievery of another sailor's tot was an extremely serious offence, and no sailor would have dared anger their messmates by doing that. So they could do that as well. However, one anecdote which does spring to mind is of a young sailor by the name of Kennedy Buster Brown, who served as an 18-year-old telegraphist in HMS Belfast whilst out in the Far East during her penultimate commission of 1959 to 1961. And Kennedy Brown was, as I mentioned, only 18. From all accounts, he'd been a good teenager and hadn't drunk whilst underage. And on his 18th birthday, when he was entitled to his first rum tots, as a sailor in the Navy, his messmates made a good fuss of him. He was entitled to gulpers from all of his messmates' rum tots, and described the experience as, let me just, and the other rating said, right, Buster, down the hatch, and he had to lift the glass straight away, as he wasn't allowed to taste it beforehand, and drink it all in one go. His face apparently turned red, and his eyes turned a little bit, and he thought, oh gosh, and could feel it going down his chest. And he thought, right, I'll sit down now. So he then was sat down to enjoy his meal following his rum tot and the additional gulpers from his messmates' rum tots. And unfortunately for Kennedy Brown, he fell asleep at his lunch, being unused to his first experience of rum. His messmates took sympathy on him, and in fact, the petty officer on the mess deck allowed him to get some rest in the corner, and they decided not to tell the officer on watch what had happened to him. He was allowed a couple of hours sleep to sober up, and was ready for duty afterwards. But as a first experience of his rum tot, that was certainly something a memorable 18th birthday.
I can't remember my 18th birthday, but it sounds like it went in a similar way. So, so let's move on to our 5th rum today. We've got our Black Tot Finest Caribbean. So this is the blend of the 4 rums you've just tried together. So I believe there's tremendous value in each person, you know, especially when we do trainings and master classes. I want everyone to understand the individual regions that go into a rum blend. But there's also, then you need to try the finished product. So this blend together brings together that Barbados, that fruitiness, that chocolatey from Guyana, that intensity and spice from Jamaica. And hopefully, even if you're just getting into rum for the first time, hopefully you'll be able to start to pick out some of those individual notes and sort of see, almost like listening to a band play and you hear each individual instrument come together. This is hopefully what would happen in the blend itself. So this is the goal with any blender. Our head blender at Elixir Distillers is Ollie Chilton, who put together this. It actually took 2 years and 26 different variations before they were finally happy on one. And this is it. So cheers, everyone. Enjoy. And I love drinking this, especially after doing the deconstruction, because it really allows you to sort of like see all those points hit. I kind of think of it like a flavor wheel. Like if you had fruit and tropical up here, chocolate and coffee here, the bitter licorice down here, and that intensity there. Each of those components hits a different point. And then hopefully blending it together, you get that nice rounded flavor with it. So yeah, so that's our Black Tot Finest Caribbean. It just launched at the end of last year. Hopefully you enjoy it. It makes a very good old fashioned if you're so inclined. Now, so just a couple of little technical questions we've had. We're going to come on to a bit more definition about Navy rum for some of you, so you've got that as we get on to our last rum. And then you had, what else as well? Would Ollie, good question from Colin, would Ollie have added colour if it hadn't been there already? Absolutely not. Ollie is a whiskey nerd and a purist by heart. That's why you'll find this rum isn't chill filtered. There's no sugar added to it, nothing at all. And in fact, until we actually had the individual components to play with, we were under the impression that everything was uncolored, and we were actually saying that. But then we obviously discovered that component came as a color, so we realized it had to be. The 2 Guyanas had been mixed together when we originally played with it, which was why it was only when we stripped it down that we realized that addition of color in there. Now, what was, just to give a quick overview, we won't spend too long on this, but was the British Navy the only Navy in the world, Robert, that was having the rum ration, or did we have anything going on around the world from there?
The Royal Navy was certainly renowned for its tradition of the rum ration, and in the collections of the Imperial War Museum, we've got some wonderful photographs and documentation of other Allied nations during the Second World War and afterwards, enjoying the British rum tradition. We can see in the photograph here that we have some US sailors and Marines experiencing the rum tot for themselves. Now, it's worth mentioning, at this time, the US Navy was dry. Alcohol was prohibited. And these sailors and Marines here are guests of HMS King George V out in the Pacific in August 1945, following the end of the war against the Japanese. And Admiral Nimitz, the Commander-in-Chief of the US Navy, my apologies, the HMS Duke of York. Admiral Nimitz, the Commander-in-Chief of the US Pacific Fleet, was meeting with his British counterparts in the Royal Navy Pacific Fleet aboard the Royal Navy flagship, the Duke of York. And here we can see the rum tot tradition being shared with our allies. Other nationalities who served in British ships, Norwegians, the French, the Dutch, also were entitled to the rum tots themselves while serving alongside the Royal Navy.
Fantastic. So I'm conscious we're running out of time, so I want to bring us on to our last very, very special rum, because we don't always get to taste this one because there is not very much of it left. So just to introduce, as you pour yourself the last consignment, I want to show a couple more pictures here from the courtesy of the Imperial War Museum that Robert shared with us. Now, there's a couple of things I want to point out here. Obviously, you've seen some of these in the videos before. The person with the book, the stores accountant measuring out the rum, and the larger jars, the fannies, where they had been taking it back to their mess. But I want you to just zone in on this person 3 in from the left, who's holding a little wicker covered flagon here, which you may notice sort of looks similar to this that I have here. This is the beginning of our story with Black Tot, which we come to at the end. Here's a very raucous crew getting their rum ration. They don't seem very well behaved at all. This is a much more orderly crew. This is, I'm sure, how we would behave when we're on HMS Belfast soon. But our story with Black Tot, how Black Tot actually began with these flagons. Now, here you see a crate. This is how the flagons used to be shipped in. And you can see here one cracked open. So you have to crowbar these things open. They're all nailed shut and wrapped together with tin. So very hard to get into, filled with sawdust. So they're a real pain to get out and check. And we see these now, there's little clues on all these boxes that when I'm researching the flagons I go into. So if you look at the box on the left, you'll see PKD 11/55, which means it was packed in November 1955. Clues like the fact this has got a postcode on it tells us this is, I think, late 50s, early 60s, because postcodes didn't exist before then as well. So, and these are the flagons themselves. This is the treasure inside. So these flagons, as you can see with the one I have here as well, these would have been filled with rum, 4.5 liters at a time. And inside, you can see the picture in the middle, the stone-covered flagon. This is what they look like underneath. So the wicker would have just been a way of protecting and transporting the rum. Now, why would flagons have been used instead of barrels? Well, they were easier to carry, for one. So if you were going on a submarine, for example, flagons would have been the vessel of choice. Also, if you needed to move rum around in places more confined than where barrels would have gone, flagons were a great alternative. So you do see flagons issued particularly onto Navy bases and places where they need a lot of transport and movement. And then the really exciting part for me, because I'm a nerd, is on the right-hand picture here, where you see the wax seal still intact. And around the outside, you can just make out the wording there. So I think this one is Deptford, if I'm reading that correctly, which would refer to the victualling yard where that rum would have been blended. And then 12-70 means that this flagon was sealed and bottled in December 1970. Now, not all of these flagons made it. Some of them were, like this one on the left, was stored upside down and the rum escaped and leaked out, and it looked like there were some happy mice that got in there as well. The rum on the right, you can see, was leaking, so the seal wasn't airtight. And yes, if you're wondering, I did try that rum, and no, it did not taste very good at all. So it's a real hit and miss whether these flagons survive to today. But how they first came across our path was about 13 years ago. An old sailor came to Sukhinder Singh, the owner of Whiskey Exchange and creator of Black Tot, and said to him, I have these 2 Navy rum flagons. Would you like to buy them off me? And he said, yes, I would. And then, because all the sailors have their little clubs that they all talk to each other, he told his friends that he'd sold 2 of these flagons off. And so someone else with 5 flagons came along and said, would you like to buy these off me? He said, yes, I would. And then this carried on going on until one guy came with about 10 flagons. And at that point, Sukhinder said, right, hold on, where are these flagons coming from? So he started researching it, and he called the Royal Navy, tried to find out what had happened, because Black Tot Day itself, when this came about, this was the end of a 239-year-old tradition. You know, they'd given out this rum for so long, and they finally voted. They argued about it for years, but finally the decision was taken on the 31st of July 1970 that the last ever rum rations would be given out to the Navy fleet. And you know, it was a pretty dark day. Rob, have you got any good Black Tot Day stories to throw into the mix?
Nothing more than that it sort of represented the change in attitudes in the Navy. By 1970, the ships were becoming increasingly technically advanced, certainly compared to HMS Belfast and what had come before. And it was a new era of professionalism in the Navy, and other changes in social attitudes. On the whole, the sailors' salaries were improving, and they were trusted to be able to purchase their own alcohol from then onwards from the NAFI canteen, which was run by the Navy, Army, Air Force Institutes, albeit only in open containers, so that alcohol couldn't be hoarded or traded on board. Whilst Mitch mentioned a sad day for the Navy, it represented the change in culture as the Navy became more technologically advanced and professional.
I think one of the figures that really sort of stood out for me, Rob, was you know, after World War II, I was looking at when did we invent nuclear submarines, and when were they in play? And they started in 1958. So for 12 years after we had nuclear submarines, we still had people on those submarines drinking their rum every day. And
that's a marvelous snapshot of the traditions of the Royal Navy, with advanced technology combined with cherished tradition.
Yeah. And I don't know if any of you have had a few rums and had a big red button, but I would definitely want to push that button and see what happens. Right? Let's go. All right. So yeah, probably not the best idea, and that's probably a good job I didn't join the Navy. So yes, but and I always find that there's something ironic in the fact that America were the most sensible ones and gave up the rum ration first. That just doesn't seem to match up. I don't know. Anyway, we won't get into that. But what we want to share with you as our final rum today is a little tot of the very rum that they would have had back in the day. Now, I sort of, a couple of people asked, you know, were Navy rums aged in a particular way or from a particular place? Well, by today's standards, not really. Today's standards, you can pretty much call your rum a Navy rum, and you don't have to tick any boxes. You know, there are certain general trends that Navy rums will follow, but there is no set, you know, this is what a Navy rum has to be. And this, for me, is why this rum is so exceptional and so exciting, is that this is the actual rum that they had on those ships. This is the actual Navy rum blend. And to give you an idea of how this was put together, they built a giant blending vat system right on the River Thames in the India docks, and they had 3 giant open wooden vats where they would bring all of the rum to these docks and then offload it and blend these rums into the vats. Now, before then, it was really a case of you got whichever casks you could, you drank whichever you wanted to, and whatever was left was left. And they very quickly realized this wasn't a good way of managing and accounting for the rum coming in and off of ships. So by bringing everything back to London, by centralizing it there, it allowed the Navy a great deal of control over how the rum was issued. It allowed everything to be brought down to the standard proof of 54.5% ABV. And from a merchant point of view, if they were bringing rum from the Caribbean to sell privately, it allowed them to tax them the full amount, which they couldn't do if it was sold overseas. So obviously taxes were still a thing then. So the Navy rum blend itself was started in the early 1800s, blended in these vats, and continuously topped up and continuously added to. To give you an idea, the 3 wooden vats themselves would have had a pipe about 1/3 of the way up, allowing all 3 vats to blend together and intermingle. They were completely open topped. So the angel share, again, the evaporation of this rum was huge. Even in London, you got around 10% a year was being evaporated off from this rum blend. They caught fire twice. You'll be able to find old records of these vats catching fire and the whole top of the vats being alight. It actually took the fire brigade about a week, the first time it ever happened, to put out the fire, because every time they came in, the fumes from the rum kept making them drunk and they couldn't actually fight the fire. So they had to work out a way of getting at it. And so these vats saw some history, and pretty much for about 150 years, this blend was continuously topped up, blended, added to, put back in casks and sent back out to sea. So every year the rum blend changed. Every year it was adapting and evolving depending on which islands and which countries were able to make the most amount of rum. So was there a set recipe of rum? Well, there was, but every year that was changing and evolving, and they would adjust accordingly depending on the supplies they had. So this rum for me is, you know, it's a bit of history. It's a rum that we could never make again, you know, brought from distilleries which don't exist anymore, aged in sea, in casks at sea when it was transported over, and then blended in these giant vats, which, you know, again, to do that today, it just wouldn't make sense in any kind of production model to do it. Although we are talking about it, it might still happen. So if I can convince them, we will. But so yes, so your final rum today, a little taste of history, the same rum that would have been enjoyed almost 50 years ago today on Black Tot Day. This is our last consignment. And yeah, a little drop of history. So enjoy. You may notice, I love this rum. It's like, there are so many layers and so many different things to it. And even if you're not a rum lover, like, give it time, just come back to it. Save a little bit and come back to it later, because this is a rum. I remember the first time I ever tried this, it would have been almost 10 years ago now. And I was like, okay, yeah, that's cool rum. And now I look back on that moment and how I tasted that rum, and I'm like, it's kind of like if someone gave you a really expensive wine or whiskey or something, and I just didn't get it at the time. And then the more I've come back to it over the years, the more I've appreciated what went into this rum. Yeah, it's really quite incredible. So yeah, I'm very glad we got to share some of this with you today. To give you an idea, a couple of questions here. It was bottled in 2010, so it was actually bottled for the 40th anniversary of Black Tot Day 10 years ago. How much of it is left? We have just shy of about 3,000 bottles left. So there was a fair amount of Navy rum flagons left. Luckily, Sukinda pretty much managed to track them all down around the world. But for this blend, yeah, just under 3,000 bottles left worldwide, although potentially quite a lot less if we do our job right this year. Where was it stored for 50 years? It was stored in these flagons, and it made its way around the world. So after the Navy got rid of some of its victualling warehouses, they sold off a lot of the rum. It changed hands several times. It went between different wine companies, booze companies, spirits companies that were buying and selling it, and some went bust, and some went to the States, and some went to France, and these flagons ended up all around the world. And every now and then you'll still see one pop up in someone's private collection, but yeah, we think we've got most of them. So, and in terms of how much it retails for, I believe on Whiskey Exchange it's about £650. So not the cheapest rum out there, but again, it's very hard when something has no way of ever being made again. How do you put a price on it? And for me, this is one of the things I love about rum. If this was a whiskey, it would probably be about 10 times that price. It would be absolutely insane. So at least in rum, you can, in whiskey you could add a zero, absolutely. So yeah, if you want an investment, buy a couple so you can drink one at least. But yes, I hope you enjoy this essay. It's very, very special and very dear to me. And regardless of your taste in rum, I think there is no rum blend in the world that is as historical or has as much history behind it as this blend does. So, Rob, how do you find it?
Well, I must admit I'm somewhat inexperienced in rum tasting, say, compared to whiskey, but I think you've certainly managed to convert me this afternoon.
Yes, all right.
The Black Tot last consignment is beautifully rich, and so I'm certainly looking forward to finishing my sample. But yeah, just really grateful to you, Mitch, for inviting me to come and talk to you today about the history of the rum ration. I guess, as I mentioned at the beginning, HMS Belfast, part of the Imperial War Museum. During this period of lockdown, we have all sorts of brilliant digital resources on the Imperial War Museum website, which I thoroughly recommend you all visiting and exploring. And certainly if you have any questions subsequent to this tasting session, feel free to ask for my contact details through Emily. And when we're all back to some sort of new normal anyway, it will be a pleasure to meet any of you on the ship and show you around and show you her history.
Well, we've still got to have that boat party, Rob. So we'll definitely be seeing you. Get that grog top out. We'll bring the rum. So guys, just to wrap it up, as I say, this year is the 50th anniversary. Join us on the 31st of July. We're going to have 24 hours of rum with all different brands, distillers, blenders from around the world. And I'm sure Emily's going to send you all of those details. We've got, in my humble opinion, we've got possibly the best lineup of rum speakers of any session in the world. And it's one of those weird things that's only been made possible because no one is traveling at the moment. So it's really going to be an exceptional 24 hours. So thank you all for joining us, and I hope you enjoyed the rum.